In 1928, in a cabin set back in a hollow of the Blue Ridge, the nearest doctor was a full day's ride down the mountain. So when a child spiked a fever in the night or a man laid his hand open at the woodpile, nobody went looking for a doctor. They went looking for the grandmother. She kept no diploma on the wall. What she kept instead was 100 remedies held in her head, handed down by voice from her own grandmother all the way back across the ocean. For most of the last 100 years, we called what she knew ignorance. Old wives' tales. And then the chemists went looking, and they began finding things. That bark she steeped into a bitter tea for fever and aching joints. A clergyman named Edward Stone wrote a letter about it to the Royal Society in 1763. By 1828, a German chemist had drawn its active ingredient out and named it salicin. And in 1899, a company called Bayer turned that same compound into a small white tablet and called it aspirin. The grandmother was handing out the best-selling drug in human history 80 years before the patent. She had an old rule for reading plants, and we will come back to it. She was not guessing, she was remembering. So tonight we are counting down 30 of these vanished remedies. One was so potent the federal government finally made it a crime. One held its own in a modern clinic against the very medicine your doctor would hand you today. We begin with the gentlest. Number 30, catnip tea for a baby that would not stop crying. The plant grew near every kitchen door, and when a newborn was colicky and the cabin had gone 3 nights without sleep, the grandmother steeped a few leaves, weak and warm, and fed it off a spoon. It settled the gut and the child both, and bought a worn-out mother an hour of quiet. The next one cooled a burn that today would raise a blister. Before we go on, hit subscribe, because some of what is coming could matter to your own family someday, and you will want to find it again. Number 29, buttermilk, or a rag soaked in cider vinegar laid across a sunburn or a breakout of hives. A child who spent a July day barefoot in the field came home scalded red across the shoulders, and the cool, sour cloth drew the heat out and took the sting down. The next remedy is a weed you have stepped on 10,000 times. Number 28, a plantain leaf, chewed soft and pressed onto a bee sting, the low, broad-leafed weed in every dooryard and footpath in America. The settlers called it Englishman's foot because it sprang up wherever the white man set his boot, and the Tuscarora used it for snakebite long before they arrived. Crush the leaf, lay it on the sting, and it pulls the fire out. The next one you could brew in the dead of winter. Number 27, pine needle tea for a winter cold. When the gardens were dead and snow lay on the ridge, a handful of young needles steeped in hot water made a sharp, resiny drink we now know is rich in vitamin C, the very thing a body runs short of in the cold months. She never heard the words ascorbic acid. She knew the tea kept the winter sickness off. The next remedy settled a churning stomach. Number 26, ginger root, grated into hot water for a sour, rolling stomach. The same burning root we still keep in the kitchen, given to a seasick traveler or a child who ate too many green apples, and it eased the nausea then for the reason it does now. The next one was dripped, warm, straight into an aching ear. Number 25, the SAP of a persimmon stick, warmed and poured into an aching ear. A woman named Minnie Daly told the Foxfire students how they laid a green persimmon stick in the fire until the sap ran frothy out the end, looking like soap suds, and caught it on a spoon and poured it gently into the sore ear. The next remedy made warts disappear, or so they swore. Number 24, rubbing a wart with a slice of raw Irish potato, then burying the potato under the porch step so the wart would rot away with it. Here we cross from medicine into ritual, and the old-timers swore by it just the same. The next one would burn if you trusted it too long. Everything so far was kitchen table kind, the gentle end of the cabinet. From here, the remedies start to bite back. The next stretch could hurt you, and a few came closer to killing the patient than the sickness ever would have. Number 23. An onion poultice laid hot on the chest for a deep, rattling cough. The grandmother fried sliced onions soft, wrapped them in cloth, and bound the steaming bundle over a child's congested lungs. The whole cabin filled with the smell of it, a smell that, for a certain kind of older person, still means being small and sick and looked after. The next one could blister a child's skin if you left it on too long. Number 22. The mustard plaster used for pneumonia and chest cold was real medicine and real danger in the same cloth. You mixed ground mustard with flour and water, spread the paste between 2 layers of fabric, and laid it on the chest. The mustard oil drove a warmth deep into the lungs that genuinely helped a person breathe. But you watched the clock, because left on too long, it scalded the skin raw and could burn a sick child badly. The next one they reached for after a snake bite, and it was 90 proof. Number 21. Horseradish root for a stuffed head and thin blood. The grandmothers grated the burning root much the way we might use a decongestant to clear the sinuses, and fed the red of the root as a tonic they called a blood builder to bring a pale, run-down body back to strength. The next remedy was the only painkiller most families ever had. Number 20. Whiskey. For snakebite, for a wound that had to be cleaned, the bottle was the mountain's only anesthetic. The plain truth under the folklore is that there was nothing else to dull the agony. No morphine, no ether, only the burn of corn whiskey and somebody to hold you down. The remedy was very nearly as dangerous as the bite. The next one they packed straight into open wounds. Number 19. A wad of spider web, balled up and pressed into a deep cut to stop the bleeding. The web did help the blood clot. The fine threads gave it something to grip, so it worked often enough to earn its place. But it carried whatever filth was on it straight into the wound, and the tetanus that could follow was a price these families paid more than once. The next one was swallowed by the spoonful, and it is very nearly paint thinner. Number 18. Turpentine, the thin, sharp spirit pressed from pine resin. The mountain families took it inside the body, a few drops on a spoonful of sugar to drive out worms, and painted it on cuts as an antiseptic. A teaspoon was medicine. A little more was poison, and the line between the two was frighteningly thin when the patient was a small child, and the dose was measured by a tired hand in lamplight. The next was a plug of the most addictive plant ever grown in these hills. And from here the cabinet turns. What is coming is a remedy so beloved and so dangerous that the government eventually reached onto the shelves of America and made it a crime to sell. Stay close. Number 17. A tobacco poultice mashed and laid on a bee sting, a spider bite, or a snake bite. The same leaf that hung curing in half the barns in Appalachia was pressed wet onto a wound to draw the venom. The nicotine in it does have a real numbing, drawing effect on the skin. They reached for what they grew. The next remedy was the most beloved taste of springtime in these mountains, and the government outlawed it. Number 16. The sassafras spring tonic. Every March, the grandmother dug the roots of the sassafras tree, boiled them into a fragrant red-brown tea, and dosed the whole household to clean the blood after the long cold. Sassafras was once among the first things this continent shipped back to Europe, and its flavor was the soul of old-fashioned root beer. Then the chemists looked closer. The oil in those roots is mostly a compound called safrole. When fed to laboratory animals in the late 1950s, it grew tumors in their livers. In 1960, the Food and Drug Administration did something it has almost never done. It reached onto America's kitchen shelves and banned a beloved food outright, declaring sassafras tea illegal to sell. The next 8 were the actual job of keeping people alive. Number 15. Sulfur and molasses, the spring purge. Once a year, the grandmother stirred powdered sulfur into thick blackstrap molasses and spooned a dose into every member of the household, young and old, to open the system and clear out the winter. Children lined up for it the way they lined up for nothing else they hated more. The next broke the kind of fever that felt like it was breaking your bones. Number 14. Bone set tea for the deep, racking fevers. The plant earned its grim, honest name from the illnesses it treated, the bone break fevers, where the ache goes so far into the joints a person swears their skeleton is splitting. The grandmother brewed it into one of the bitterest cups in the whole pharmacopoeia and gave it to a patient to sweat a fever down and bring the fever to break. When a fever could carry off a child in a night, bone set was a front-line weapon. It could even pull infection out of a wound when nothing else would. Number 13. The slippery elm poultice, and the bark chewed for a raw throat. Under the bark lies a thick, slick inner layer that swells into a soothing gel the moment it meets water. Steeped into a drink, it coated a throat rubbed raw from coughing. Mashed into a poultice over a splinter, a boil, or an infected cut, it drew the wound to a head and pulled the poison out. The next remedy they buried in the wound on purpose. Number 12. A poultice of charcoal or fine clay packed onto a wound or a snake bite to draw the poison out of the flesh. And this may be the most quietly vindicated of all, because the principle the grandmothers leaned on, adsorption, the way certain porous materials seize and hold poisons against their surface, is the same principle behind the activated charcoal on the crash cart in every emergency room today. The modern hospital reaches, in effect, for a refined version of the grandmother's mud. The next remedy stopped a bleed that would have emptied a man. Hold on to that, science circling back to confirm the old way, because every remedy left on this list, all the way down to number 1, is one the laboratory eventually proved right. Watch. Number 11. Yarrow packed into a wound to stop the bleeding. This herb is so old that its Latin name, Achillea, ties it to Achilles, said to have carried it to dress his soldiers' wounds on the battlefields of the ancient world. The mountain grandmothers crushed the feathery leaves and pressed them into a deep cut where the plant's compounds helped the blood clot and close. On a homestead, a day from any doctor, a gash at the woodpile could bleed a person white, and a plant that stopped the flow was not folklore. It was survival. The next remedy knit a broken bone back together. Number 10. Comfrey, the plant the old people called knit bone for sprains and breaks. They mashed the great root and leaves into a poultice and bound it over a closed fracture, and the bone healed faster for it. And they were right about the mechanism, because comfrey root is rich in a compound called allantoin, shown to speed the growth of new cells and bone tissue. But there was a danger folded inside that tradition only half understood. Taken internally over time, the same plant carries alkaloids that quietly poison the liver, which is why it belongs on the skin and never now down the throat. The next was the grandmother's most dangerous and most necessary work. Number 9. Blue cohosh and black haw, the labor herbs of the midwife. This was the granny woman at the center of her calling, because in a mountain cabin, a hard birth was the line between one fresh grave and three, the mother and the child both. She kept herbs to bring on a stalled labor, and herbs to quiet a womb that threatened to lose its baby too soon, and she sat through the long nights with her hands and her prayers, the only help for miles. The next remedy she dug out of the mountainside and sold for hard cash. Number 8. Ginseng, the root the mountain people called sang, dug from the deep shade of the coves. It was a tonic, but it was also money, often the only money a land-poor family ever saw. In the 1880s, a store ledger in western North Carolina recorded a man trading 12 pounds of sang at 40 cents a pound for calico, salt, and coffee. By 1927, a dealer in Statesville paid $10 a pound for clean wild root when other roots brought a penny. A day climbing a steep cove for one man-shaped root could pay the taxes on the farm. From here down, every remedy has been proven in a laboratory. Number 7 is where the old rule finally pays off. Number 7. Yellow root, the bitter antiseptic, and the place I have to tell you about the grandmother's rule. The old healers carried a principle brought across the ocean and centuries old, called the doctrine of signatures, the belief that a plant tells you what it is for by the way it looks. A heart-shaped leaf was for the heart, and yellow root, whose root runs a vivid, startling yellow the moment you break it, was read as a sign for the yellow sicknesses, the liver, the bile, the jaundice. So they gargled the bitter wash for a sore throat and laid it on infected sores. When chemists analyzed that yellow root, they found inside it an alkaloid called berberine with real, measured antibacterial power. It was so real. The plant carries other substances that help slip it past the very pumps bacteria use to expel such things. The yellow was not magic. It was a memory, and it was correct. The next remedy grows right beside the thing it cures. Number 6. Jewel weed for poison ivy. Jewel weed, with its little orange trumpet of a flower and its watery stem, springs up in the same damp ground as poison ivy, the antidote planted next to the affliction. The mountain people who learned it from the Potawatomi and the Chippewa snapped the juicy stem and rubbed the cool sap onto the rash. And in 2012, in the Journal of Ethnopharmacology, researchers found the fresh plant mash genuinely reduced the rash, the saponins doing the work, exactly as tradition promised. There was a sharp catch. The fresh crushed plant worked, but the bottled extract off a store shelf did not. The next remedy our hospitals are now putting back on their own shelves. 3 remedies left, the heaviest of all, the ones a grandmother reached for first when a wound turned bad or a fever would not break. They are also the 3 most completely confirmed by science. Number 5. Honey, spread thick on a wound or a burn. The grandmothers laid it over a stubborn sore and bound it up. As honey meets the moisture of a wound, an enzyme in it slowly releases hydrogen peroxide, a gentle disinfectant. The sheer density of its sugar pulls the water out of bacteria and kills them where they sit. Certain honeys, the manuka among them, carry a compound called methyl glyoxal that destroys even the resistant bacteria that shrug off our strongest drugs. Medical-grade honey dressings are manufactured and sold to hospitals today for the wounds that will not close. The next was the poor family's antibiotic, generations before penicillin was a word. Number 4. Garlic, the infection fighter. When a wound went hot and angry, the grandmother crushed raw garlic and pressed it to the skin or fed it down by the clove. There was true medicine in it because crushing a clove releases a compound called salicin that genuinely kills bacteria. In the wars of the last century, when the wounded outran the antiseptics, garlic was packed into wounds at the front and earned the nickname Russian penicillin. The next combined this very plant with another, and a clinic put the result against a doctor's prescription. Number 3. Mullein and garlic ear oil for a child's earache, the one I promised you would meet. The grandmother gathered the soft yellow flowers of the mullein plant, the tall woolly stalk on every roadside, and steeped them in warm oil with garlic. When a child woke in the night screaming with an earache, she warmed a few drops and let them fall into the sore ear. For generations, the doctors who heard about it smiled and called it an old wives' tale. Then, in 2001 and again in 2003, a team led by a physician named Sarel tested an ear oil made of exactly these things against the anesthetic eardrops a doctor would prescribe in real children with real ear infections. The herbal oil controlled the pain just as well as the pharmacy bottle, and the very last remedy is sitting in your medicine cabinet right now under a brand name. Number 2, willow bark for fever and pain, and we end the countdown of the plants where this story began. This is the bark the grandmother steeped into a bitter tea for aching joints and burning fevers, and that bitterness was its own kind of signature, the taste that told the old healers it was strong. A clergyman named Edward Stone wrote up its power to the Royal Society in 1763. A chemist named Buchner drew the compound salicin out of it in 1828. And by 1899, Bayer had turned its refined descendant into a small white tablet called aspirin. The oldest, plainest remedy on this list became the most widely taken drug on Earth, which leaves the one thing that made all 29 others work, and it is the one we lost completely. Number 1 is not a plant at all. It is the grandmother herself and the knowledge she carried, because no single remedy on this list was ever the real medicine. The real medicine was the woman, the one who knew which of 100 plants to reach for, and how much, and at what hour, and for which patient, and when to use nothing at all and simply sit through the night holding a hand. She held an entire pharmacy in her memory with not one page written down, and passed it the only way it could be passed, mouth to ear, mother to daughter. And that old rule of hers, the doctrine of signatures, the yellow root for the yellow sickness, was never the superstition we took it for. It was a memory system, a way to keep a vast, hard-won body of knowledge alive in a world that could not write it down, by hanging each remedy on a hook the mind could hold. And when the chemists at last went looking, plant after plant turned out to hold exactly the kind of compound the old rule had quietly predicted. She was reading the world correctly. We simply stopped listening. And when the last of these grandmothers died, a library burned that no one had thought to copy. So that is the cabinet they kept, the one we emptied and forgot. And the strange thing, the thing I hope stays with you, is how little of it was ignorance and how much was only knowledge we had not yet caught up to. The bark became the aspirin in your chest. The honey is back on the hospital shelf. The earache oil held even with the doctor's drops. She was not guessing. She was remembering all along. So here is what I will ask. The next time something small goes wrong, before you reach for the bottle, think of the old way. And if it is safe and simple, try it just once. And then tell me down in the comments, because every one of us has one. What was the single remedy your own grandmother swore by? Leave it below so it does not vanish too. Next time, we follow these same mountain women from the sickbed to the spinning wheel, into the dying art of wool carding, the skill the colonial women carried to the grave, the work that clothed a whole family before a store ever sold a single thread. Subscribe so you do not miss it. She could read a plant by its signature. The least we can do is remember her by hers.